we're very, very excited to have Leah Webb today with us, who is not only an author, specifically the author of grain-free, dairy-free, let me get this right, and yes, and sugar-free family cookbook. Of course, as you can guess, she is not just an author, she is a health coach, but she is also a mother of two. And we're excited to have her today because we would love to hear about her journey on writing this book, specifically a book aimed to work with restrictive diets. So with no further ado, I'd like to ask Leah to join us. Welcome, Leah.
Hey, thanks for having me, Romina.
How are you today?
I'm doing good. Yeah, it's a nice, warm summer day out, and yeah, hoping to get some work done in the garden later today.
Amazing, amazing. Well, it's evening time in the UK, as you know, but it's daytime for you. She's all the way in the US, but she's made time to be with us and share her journey on understanding how to create fun, exciting meals around restrictive diets. I also wanted to say it's going to be about 15-20 minutes question and answers between Leah and myself. And then please do feel free to put in your questions on the Q&A chat or on the message panel. And we'll definitely ask some of these questions to Leah. So tell us, Leah, a little bit about your journey. How did you decide to start this book? And what pushed you to write specifically a book and a specific meal planning around restrictive diets?
Yeah, so it's kind of an unexpected turn in my career that I started writing this book. I have a background actually in soil science and public health. And so I have been growing healthy foods, eating healthy foods, really dedicated to a healthy diet for a long time. And then when I got pregnant, my son was born and he had severe food allergies and asthma. And so even though I felt like I had put in the time and the work to be a healthy individual, I still had this son who had some issues. And some of the foods that he was allergic to are, and this has changed over time, but he remains allergic to wheat and barley. And his allergy is so severe that we do carry an EpiPen, and we can't eat at restaurants. And so it's really a challenging allergy to manage. And then my daughter was born 3 years later, and she has cystic fibrosis, which is a genetic disease impacting the lungs and pancreas. And so I found myself in this position of being somebody who had been dedicated to health, who had felt like they were doing the right things to support my health and my children's health, yet I still had these circumstances that arose that were pretty much out of my control. And that's when I turned to even more fine-tuning our diet to try to find some solutions that could support my kids. And that's when I looked to grain-free, dairy-free, and sugar-free. And so those foods seem to address, for our specific health needs, that seemed to address the problem. But the problem then became that when you start cooking all of these foods, it can become a really labor-intensive process. And the people who need these restrictive diets can often get burnt out on it because it does feel like a lot of work and it feels very laborsome. And I wanted to be doing other things other than just cooking and supporting my children's health. I wanted to be outside and working in my garden and riding my bike and doing these other things. And so what I figured out how to do is to streamline this meal planning process. And that's what I wrote this cookbook about. So my book uses a lot of fresh vegetables. I focus on quality foods and providing people with delicious recipes that can also be prepped in bulk and frozen and then incorporated into meal plans so that it simplifies the process of meal planning and prep. I think when you think about the historical significance of eating family meals, it used to be that the woman was at home. But then once women joined the workforce, we then have this added challenge of providing income for our families while also being expected to do all the housekeeping. And so I think that the position that we're in now is that we know how valuable diet is in supporting our health, but we need some modern solutions in order to actually get back in the kitchen and make that a reality when we do have a very busy population. So yeah, so that was the inspiration, was just going through these challenges with my own kids and recognizing the importance of a healthy diet, but then also recognizing that I needed some solutions to make it manageable over a lifetime.
Sorry, I think I muted myself. How would you say in terms of the meal prepping, how was that a difficult journey for you in terms of, it's obviously very time consuming to cook 100% of your meals, and are there any tips that you can give us on meal prepping for families?
Yeah, my advice is to A, recognize that it's not easy when you start. And I think that that's the message that we often get, is that this is easy, anyone can do it. And the truth is that anyone can do it, but it's not necessarily easy when you start. And so that's one of the messages that I like to try to get out there with people, is that if you're meal planning for the first time and it feels hard, it's because you're doing it right. And so, but the goal of meal planning is to practice, get better at it. And then over time, what happens is it just becomes second nature. So when you're first starting this out, I think that the thing to do is to start with, because the goal is that you sit down, you make your plan, and then you're not having to think about it the rest of the week. You're doing your shopping once, you've got your plan, at 5 o'clock, how many people think, oh gosh, what am I going to eat? And this happens, we eat 365 days a year, so it's no surprise that we're going to need dinner at some point. Yet we seem to put it off in our minds. And so if you sit down and make this plan, then that conundrum suddenly disappears. So it really saves you a lot of stress. So I think when you're starting out, if you can recognize that it is a new skill and that it can be challenging, but that if you keep practicing, it gets easier. And that the ultimate goal is that you're going to be saving yourself a lot of time in the long run. And so if you can recognize that putting that effort up front may feel hard, but it will be worth the effort. And so it may be that if you're relying on a lot of restaurant meals or packaged foods or things like that, it may be that your starting point is that you're only planning 3 or 4 dinners a week, and that you get good at that. And then once you get good at that, then you maybe add in a 4th or 5th dinner, a 6th or 7th dinner. And one thing that I do always like to recommend to people with meal planning is that if you're looking for one meal to start with, I actually recommend breakfast. And the reason for that is because this is the meal that people are least likely to have time to cook in the morning. And this is also the meal that I feel like really sets you up for stable blood sugar for the day. So if you're eating these carb-rich, sugary breakfasts that are convenient, then that's going to set you up for this roller coaster for the entire day. It's going to be harder to feel your best. So if you can really focus on prepping something in advance that focuses on proteins and fats and more of a balanced approach, then I think you're going to be setting yourself up better for the entire day, which will make the rest of it feel easier.
That's really interesting. Yes. So we plan the meals, small, one thing at a time, plan the breakfast meals. But when you don't have any inspiration, what do you do at that point? Let's say you have a difficult child and the child isn't willing to try what you want, even if they are dairy-free or gluten-free. How do you get your child to respond positively to eating your food?
So that is a question that I could actually talk about for probably an entire hour. So I'll try to just give some really quick sort of guidance that can be helpful when you're first starting this out. So I think the first thing to remember is that getting kids interested in new foods, no matter what it is, the key to it is repeated exposure in a low pressure environment. So you can't tell your kids that they have to eat something, but you also have to understand that if they've never seen this food, why would they want to put it in their mouths? And so we have to understand that kids need to be exposed to foods again and again and again and again. And once we start doing that, then that food becomes more familiar. An example that I like to provide to adults, and this is an example that some adults like, but not everyone, are things like canned fish, like sardines or anchovies or even mussels or oysters. If this is something that you have never eaten and somebody put this food in front of you, you would not want to eat it. It takes repeated exposure in order for you to get used to it. And so when you are exposing your kids to these new foods, one thing that you can do is, The other thing to think about is if you want them to eat a red pepper and you put an entire pile of red pepper on their plate, this feels overwhelming. Start with a bite, start with something that doesn't feel intimidating to them, and that, it's okay if they play with it. It's okay if they touch it. It's okay if they smell it. They don't have to put it in their mouths. They just really need that initial visual exposure, and it has to be repeated. And then over time, what you'll see is that they will come around to the idea of actually trying some of these foods. The other thing that I really like to do with kids is try to make it fun. And it is hard to have your kids in the kitchen. I will admit that, there are weeks, even months that go by when I don't do it because they're not helpful. But having them in there when I can handle it is really beneficial. And sometimes what I'll do is give them tasks that have absolutely nothing to do with what I'm doing. And so, for example, you can buy these nylon knives for kids where they can chop their own, and it depends on the age of your kid. I mean, my son, who's almost 8, he can use a real knife, but my daughter, who just turned 5, she still uses a nylon knife. So let's say I'm making, I'm chopping potatoes, and or we're making tacos or something like that, and she says, I want to help. I can give her a cucumber to chop, or I can give her a banana to chop and tell her that that's how I would like for her to help. And what you see is that when kids are involved in the process, they have natural curiosity. And so if you can use that tool to your benefit, then that's how to get them interested in these new foods. Forcing them to try things, and that puts too much pressure on them. So trying to make it fun, trying to make it engaging, and then just really trying to exercise patience as much as you can. And if you do have a garden, I mean, this is where I've seen just leaps and bound improvements from kids. I managed a learning garden for 2 years, and these kids were arguing over things like who got to eat the raw Brussels sprouts. And these are not arguments that you normally have among kids, but it was because they were planting these seeds and watching it grow, and they were actually invested. And when you're eating fresh foods, they taste so much better than getting something that isn't fresh. And so I think kind of flipping our idea of how it is that we can get the kids involved is the best solution. Give them some power, give them some choices, ask them what they would like to cook. With my older son, sometimes, because he does see the foods that other kids are eating when kids were still in school. and sometimes we start to butt heads over it, and we start to have this power struggle. And then so I ask him, well, why don't you plan a meal this week? Why don't you pick out something that we're going to eat? And so I've noticed if I can give a little bit, then it seems to just ease the situation altogether. And so giving your kids some ownership, some power, some choice, repeated exposure, trying to make food fun, and just remember that it does take time and patience. And again, none of this stuff happens overnight. Learning to meal plan, changing your kids' eating habits, you just have to be committed and stick with it, and then commit to the process of repeating it.
Absolutely. That's really, really interesting tips to manage children and their expectations. Absolutely. Interestingly, a question came up around partners being difficult. So we know that children can be very difficult, but what about partners that can be quite fussy, quite picky? They may not want these restrictive diets in their lives. And, it's really difficult to start cooking so many different meals in one household and try to cater to everyone. How do you manage that?
So luckily, that hasn't been an issue for me, but this is an issue that I do hear from other people. And one of the things that I feel somewhat firm about is that if I am going to be the one cooking the meal, preparing the meal, doing the shopping, doing the planning, that it is impossible for me to cook more than one meal. It's just not going to happen. And so if I was in this instance, and I know this is different for everybody, and it is hard to say exactly what I do if I wasn't living that, but I would just tell that person, this is what I'm making, and you're welcome to eat it. And if not, you may need to find some other options. The other thing is that the language that you use with kids is actually beneficial language to use around adults as well, because this also teaches your kids better eating habits. And so one of the things that you can say with adults as well, I know this sounds ridiculous, but instead of saying, I don't like that, start saying, I'm learning to like that. So it means I don't like it yet. And that can be another thing you say, well, you know, mom has made sweet potatoes. I don't like those yet, but I'm learning to like it. And so then it kind of gives the kid like, oh, well, he doesn't or she doesn't like it yet, but maybe in the future they might do it. So that is a really difficult question to answer. And I think it really just takes somebody saying, this is important to me. This is something I need. And I don't expect you to feel like you have to be on board, but I also don't have the energy to do more than this.
And I like what you said about using positive affirmations with our partners so that then the children can mimic that language as well when they're, you know, having a positive relationship with food, essentially.
Yeah.
How did you come up with the recipes, Lee? Was
So
it experimental or?
this is just what I cook on every day. And so I have a huge garden, and anybody who gardens knows that there are times over the summer where you just have this tremendous amount of vegetables, and figuring out what to do with it can be challenging. And so I think this is, you know, I also am lucky in that my mom always cooked. My mom had a big garden. I watched her cook. And so I think a lot of the inspiration just came from my garden and seeing this bounty. And I think there's a lot of creativity that you get from being in the garden, and calm and peace. I mean, there's so many benefits that you get from gardening. That's another thing that I hope, you know, that I've seen kind of a revived interest in now that more people are spending more time at home, is, you know, just seeing these vegetables coming out of there and thinking creatively about how it is that you can use them. But then the other side to this is that because I do have 2 young kids and I do work and I do have this garden, I have to do all of this efficiently. And so I want to be serving my family things that taste good, but that are also simple to prepare and that I can make large quantities of them. And so that we can either reheat them as leftovers, or I can freeze them and use them for a later date. So I think my inspiration was coming from kind of this creative standpoint of really enjoying being in the garden, and also this very functional standpoint of I need this to be efficient. So yeah, and I think and I think everyone agrees, I use a lot of garlic, herbs, spices. I use a lot of natural flavorings to boost the flavor of these meals. And it works out. I mean, as long as you're using these fresh ingredients, vegetables can be such a delicious thing, and when prepared correctly.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit more about these restrictive diets that your children have. So if your son has allergies, I'm assuming you're cutting out dairy from his diet. And with your daughter that has cystic fibrosis, what kind of diet is she on? Is she also dairy-free and gluten-free?
Yeah, so our diet has shifted a little bit as our needs have changed. And I think that's true for anybody who's following a restrictive diet. I think that you get as restrictive as you need it to be. And then as you start to experience healing and shifts and movements in that, then you tend to loosen the reins, which is kind of where we're at this point. So my son, his condition is dramatically better than it used to be. He used to be rashy. He was on asthma medications. He had a long list of anaphylactic allergens and sensitivities, and all of those things have disappeared with the exception of wheat and barley. So this is, I kind of call it hard lines and soft boundaries. And so this is a hard line for us. We absolutely cannot eat gluten just because of the health consequences. And so my daughter, as a result, is also gluten-free. So we haven't eaten gluten in about 8 years now. And you know, and there is no choice there. That's just the way it is. And that's okay. You know, we've gotten used to it. It's just the way that life is. As far as the dairy goes, we eliminated dairy fully for about 3 years. And with the improvements that I saw with my kids, we've now started eating a little bit more of that, but I am really particular about the quality of the dairy that we get. So grass-fed, raw. There is a woman where I can get milk locally from her cow, Myrtle. And so I do focus on quality if we are going to eat dairy. And then I think across the board, everybody, regardless of your health status, can certainly benefit from not eating sugar, except for on rare occasions. I don't think that we need to say that sugar is just this terrible food, especially when we're talking to kids about sugar. I think that just letting them know that it's just another food, but that it's not something that we eat every day is the way to communicate this. But I do think, we continue to avoid sugar pretty much as we possibly can. And so in my cookbook, the recipes that I have, I've used blended dried dates in order to create some desserts. And the reason for this is because dates actually do have a nutritional profile. So yes, they are going to be higher in sugar as compared to eating, a whole fruit, something that isn't dried. But I do think, people like to have celebrations, and food is supposed to be this joyful thing. And we don't need to, if you are following a restrictive diet, if you want it to work for the long term, you do have to have some exceptions, and you do have to feel that food is joyful and celebratory. And so that's why I've included some of these sweet treats. My kids, every now and then, they'll get ice cream, or my daughter, because she doesn't have, she does have cystic fibrosis, which is a medical reason that she should be following a restrictive diet. But with my son, I mean, it's just, it cannot be allowed. It's a hard line, like I said. And so with my daughter, when she was in school and there were shared treats, I mean, she would have some of those shared treats for the same reason that I want food to feel joyful for my kids. And they're too young to understand all of the reasons behind our restrictive diet. And so that's why I try to stay light in talking to my kids about this. But yeah, so that's where we're at. We rarely eat grains. We eat lots of vegetables. I mean, I think that's the other thing with eliminating grains is what you see is that, there's all these starchy vegetables that can serve as carbohydrates, and they're really nutrient dense and really tasty too. And I also like to focus on local foods, and there is no local place growing grain where I live. And I think that's true for a lot of people. But there are people growing potatoes and sweet potatoes and winter squash and carrots and beets and all these really delicious foods that are other options that I can get locally that are nourishing and that I think are delicious. So that's the restrictive diet that we, I guess we kind of loosely follow parts of it, and then we very strictly follow other parts of it based on our specific needs. And I know, when we started following this diet, it was much stricter, and that was because that's what we needed in that moment. And in this moment, our needs have changed a little bit. And I think that's something to remember when you are following a restrictive diet, is that just because you're doing something now, it may not necessarily mean that you have to do it forever, but it may just be that this is what you have to do for a few years.
Absolutely. I mean, you were mentioning to me the last time we spoke that the food allergens for your son went down from 7 to 2. So that's quite a big achievement, I think, in terms of, him actually not having any symptoms or not being rashy or any of those issues that you spoke about.
It was. And that was such a hard piece too, because now our hard lines are down to wheat and barley, but it used to be eggs, dairy, tree nuts. I mean, it was this huge list, and it's hard to maintain that strictly all the time. And, so I was really thankful that he was able to start eating these foods, especially eggs. Eggs are like my favorite thing ever.
Yeah, that's really hard. And before you get onto the recipes of the book, you have a little bit of science and, other explanations. Can you tell us a little bit more about what inspired you to write those sections?
Yeah, I am a very thorough person. Any of my friends will tell you that. And I feel like in order to make moves towards something, I have to understand why. Why would I want to eliminate grains? Why would I eliminate dairy? I mean, I think you hear people talking about these different diets and they all work for someone. But I want to know why, so that I know what my choices are and what is the diet that makes the most sense for me. And so I felt like it was necessary to incorporate that piece because, especially for people who are going to alternative care physicians and are getting these recommendations from their doctors, one of the things is that doctors don't necessarily have the time to always explain these things thoroughly to their patients. And so I felt like I wanted to compile all of this information in one place so that my cookbook became a complete guide. so that you not only understood how to implement the diet, but that you also got this piece that I call intellectual motivation. And so that helps you understand why this is necessary, why this might be a diet that you would choose, and what are some of the ways that you can then implement the diet.
We do have a lot of practitioners on our on this group, so I think that the why is very explanatory for us in terms of practitioners, but we also have a lot of informed audiences and parents that are interested in understanding, you know, as I said, how can we make things easier for ourselves? How can we make our lives easier? What would you say is the biggest challenge you've had so far with cooking?
That's a great question. No one's ever asked me that. I think it's probably, I would have to say, just maintaining this kind of staying a few steps ahead, because I do think that that is the way to make any diet easier, is that you stay a few steps ahead. But sometimes you get tired and you don't necessarily feel like staying a few steps ahead. And so that's where I think the solution I've come up for that is I do keep some random packaged things around that I feel like are acceptable, so that when I just feel like I run out of energy, I have things that I can fall back on. And those are things like those coconut wraps. I don't know if, do you know what I'm talking about? It's like a tortilla, but it's made out of coconut.
The gluten-free tortillas.
Yeah, so I do try to keep some things around to where I can give myself this break. And I think, but that is the biggest challenge, is that you know the cooking is good for you. You know it's better for the environment. You know that it's going to help you feel your best. I mean, you know all of these benefits, but then you still just get tired and lose energy. And I think that's a common theme that I've seen among other people who are dealing with chronic illness too, is that maintaining this level of commitment can feel tiresome at times. And so I think that's been the biggest challenge for me. And I think that's where I've just had to give myself permission to be human every now and then, and let some of these exceptions, let it go sometimes, and then just come back to it. And I think that's how you make progress in any area, is that you give yourself the space you need. You don't just let that completely sabotage your efforts, and then you just get back to it when it makes sense to do so.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I also think that sometimes when children go to birthday parties, or they're, you know, going out to school and they might eat something wrong, how do you manage all of that? And if let's say there is a flare up of a symptom, you know, how do you actually manage that? Are there specific foods then that you have to help them heal from that situation?
Yeah, so parties, and because I do have these two kids with different scenarios, I actually respond differently to both of them. So with my son, because he just cannot eat these shared foods, it used to be when he was younger, I could just make something for him and bring it to the party. It got to a point where he realized what I was doing, and he felt like he wanted something junky too. And so we have gotten to the point now where I do buy some type of packaged gluten-free chocolate muffin. It's a muffin thing, but it's like a cupcake basically. And so then I bring this for him to be able to eat at this party. So it stays within the strict boundary that we absolutely have to stay within, but then it also lets him feel like he's actually getting to participate. And so with him, his symptoms are just so severe that there are no, you know, we just don't let this be an exception. He would have to go to the emergency room. We'd have to give him his EpiPen. It would be traumatic for everyone. And so with him, there's just a hard line, and I do make more exceptions with him. The other thing is that I've seen as he's gotten older, he does feel like he's left out a lot. And so in order to help him feel like he's included, I mean, you know, he's 8 years old and he's never had a waffle. And recently he started asking me, will I ever be able to try a waffle? And I said, okay, well, next time we go to the store, I'll buy you a gluten-free waffle. And, you know, and so we bought some frozen gluten-free waffles, and yes, it was junk food, but there's also that emotional piece to food. So this is so hard to balance, especially with kids, and with adults too. I mean, adults are no better, honestly.
Absolutely agreed.
You know, and so with my daughter, hers is a little bit different in that she doesn't have these hard lines. And so when she does go to parties, I just kind of let that be the exception, and she gets to eat whatever she wants there. I don't make a big deal out of it. You know, it's no big deal. If she starts to have some issues with her lungs, then we will go back to not eating dairy at all, and wait till her mucus kind of calms itself down and that she's in a better place. And with my son, I just don't notice him having many trigger foods anymore. But, you know, I think with both of them, anytime that we're having some type of crisis, I just really focus on nutrition, on focusing on these healthy foods that are going to support their body. And which actually kind of brings up another point, because my daughter, when she does get sick, you know, sometimes when kids are sick or when adults are sick, they don't want to eat. And oftentimes parents will start offering these junkier foods, just trying to get calories into them. And what I have kind of come to accept is that if my kids are sick and their appetite is low, then I respect that. I'm still going to offer them these nourishing foods, and you know, lots of teas. And that is one of the times that we do start using some raw honey, because I use honey as more of like a medicinal tool rather than just an everyday food. You know, and so then we're starting to drink teas with honey in it. And so that's some form of nourishment, because when they are sick, it's important that they still drink, but they don't necessarily have to eat. And yeah, so that was a little off tangent, but I think that just focusing on nourishment is where I go when I feel like we are having some struggles with their health.
Absolutely. And I think it's a really good balance, because I think usually, as you said, mothers tend to just shove food into children even if they're sick. Not everyone does that, but like you said, if the body's healing, then why feed the child at that point? Such an interesting point. I did want to mention to everyone that we will be having a webinar with Lee at the end of, in mid-August, actually, a month from now. So I'm just going to share the screen, but can you tell us, Lee, what you'll be sharing with us in that webinar?
Yeah, and I am gonna have to look at my notes so I make sure that I address the 3 points that I'm hoping to talk to everyone about. Which is, first, I want to talk about some of the science behind the diet that my family, that's in my book and that my family follows. So thinking about why you would eliminate grains, dairy, and sugar. And then I'll also be discussing the GAPS diet, because that was a big part of the inspiration behind the way that I do feed my family and the way that I introduce solids to my daughter. So I'll start by talking about some of the science, and then I'm going to start by talking, and then I'll lead into the challenges that come along with restrictive diets, including some of the solutions with that. And then lastly, I'll talk about the practical applications of meal planning and prep, and how you just continue to make diet a regular part, or a healthy diet, how you make it a regular part of your care.
I think that's so important, because practically, I think all of us do have a few tips and tools that we've learned along the way over the years. But I feel that, you know, you spend so much time meal prepping, and you've done, you know, as you said, you spend 100% of your time sometimes making home cooked meals, that I'm sure we can pick up a lot of jewels from you and pearls of wisdom and practical applications of that. In terms of the science, we would be very excited to know a little bit more about how you use GAPS diet and the science behind some of your cooking recipes as well. And for the children's side of things, I think that's also so important to see how we can actually deal with difficult children, because I do know a lot of friends, families, practitioners that tell me about how frustrating it can be when children are difficult, and what are the tools, as you said earlier, some of the, you know, quick ones that you gave us that, you know, make them involved, make them part of everything. But so important to involve them, but also to get some more tips and tools from you to make our lives easier and to make this a very pleasant experience.
Yeah, and I think that food is and should be a pleasant experience. And even though you're following a restrictive diet, there are still a lot of possibilities there. And that's what I hope that people take home anytime they, you know, look at my book or hear me speak, is that yes, there are challenges, but there's also a lot of reward, and that there are also a lot of solutions.
So if you are interested, please do sign up on www.nutritioncollective.co.uk, and we will be sending a replay of this recording as well, in case you want to hear some of it again. But just wanted to say a big thank you to you, and that we're really looking forward to the webinar. If you want to get hold of the book, I think Jessica's put the link there from Chelsea Green Publishing, but you can also get the book on Amazon. I think it's on Kindle, Lee, as well.
Yes, and I believe, and if you go to my website, leahmwebb.com, there is an international link as well, I think to the book depository. So there are different places where you can purchase my book.
And what I'm also looking forward to, Lee, is your courses that you mentioned that you may be launching later in the year. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I have the first course that I'm going to be launching is a meal planning and prep course. And that is nearly finished. And so hopefully in the next couple of weeks, that's going to be available on my website. And actually, as of this morning, I am now under contract to write a gardening book. So that is another thing that I'm excited to be offering in the future as well.